Good morning. Our lecture today is Chapter 7, Selecting Sample, the sample selection for your research project, the choice of sampling techniques that depends on your research question and the objectives of your research, which should fit the research design. It's highly related to the methodology and the research strategy. In this lecture, we are talking about selecting samples. We expected by the end of this lecture to understand that the need for sampling in business and management, to be aware of a range of probability and non-probability sampling techniques, how to select your sample, which techniques to adopt, to be able to use a range of sampling techniques, and to be sure that your sample is representatives and it could be generalized also from the population, samples to the population, and to have enough knowledge that will help you during your research project. So let's have a look that this is the whole population, and we need to have a sample to represent the population, and each element or case that will make as a group to be considered as a sample. Why do we need sample? Because it's not easy to cover all the population. There will be some constraints that it's impracticable to take all the population. It needs a lot of expenses, budget constraints for the collection. Also the time, it's time consuming, and we need the result of data sometimes as quick as possible. So we need to have a sample instead of covering all the population. So this is the sampling techniques we can adopt to have probability, to select your sample randomly or in systematic way, or stratified or a cluster. Stratified to choose from different group, or if it's your sample or population are geographically away from each other, or non-probability, the quota, the purposive, snowball, or convenience, or the self-selection, a lot of techniques. So for the probability, the first type, the 4 stages for selecting the sample: to identify the sampling frame, to know your population for the sample, to decide on the suitable sample size, to measure the ratio of your sample to the whole population, and to select the appropriate techniques and the sample to check the sample is representing your population also. There is a problem of using existing database to consider for choosing suitable sample, maybe from phone book, from email list, etc., and extent of possible generalization from the sample. If your sample is representative for the population, then you can generalize. Otherwise, if the ratio is not enough, insufficient, so it's not easy to generalize the finding to the whole population, or it will be just generalized for the targeted participants in your questionnaire or survey, etc. The validity and reliability is very important, and to avoiding the bias in your sample. Moreover, the choice of sample size is influenced by some factors like the confidence, the accuracy. You need to be 99% or 95%, and it has some calculation. The margin of errors like T error, like alpha, to have your calculation, types of analysis and size of sample population and distribution, maybe at least 30 participants will be enough for some pilot to test your model. Other program will require more than 200, 300, whatever. And moreover, to consider the importance of the response rate, that when you calculate the number of the participants, the respondents to the whole population, and the number of the respondent to the number of the questionnaires or the participants that you are targeting, how many people that responds. If you send to 200 people and you just received 150 response, so it will be 75% the rate of the response from your sample. Estimating response rate and sample size also. So the 5 main techniques that use for probability sampling, which is adopted by most of the researcher, to select randomly from the your population through some computer program or systematic. Let's say that you give the first participant number 0 till number 200, then maybe you choose each the 5th one. You start with the 5th, with the 9th, with the 14th, etc. Or stratified, if there is from different group into number of subsets, different criteria or categories on the organization, or a cluster of the population, or maybe you have mixed techniques to choose your sample. And to consider deciding the suitable sample size is very important in order to be generalized, to be representative, and to be accurate in your study, and to have a good finding, and to choose appropriate techniques for analysis of your sample also. Non-probability samples, sampling techniques, maybe you choose the quota sampling for large population to have some groups, or purposive sampling or snowball sampling, as you start with a small number of participants and each one of them will recruit another participants and more, so you will have, it will be enlarged and a cumulative number of participants through snowball sampling. Or self-selection sampling, it will be volunteers in the organization who want to participate in this survey or a questionnaire to be part of the study. Convenience sampling, sometimes you need definite information from definite people, so you will not take sampling randomly. You need from specific people to get specific answer or information. So this is the simple information introduction to the sample selection, that the choice of your sampling techniques that depends on your research question and objectives. It fit your research design. It's related to the methodology and the strategy, if you remember the research onion. And to take in account that some factors that affecting the sample size, the confidence needed in the finding, accuracy required, and categories for analysis. To remember the frame from which you will select your sample, and if the sample frame is not possible, some organization unwilling to reveal the accurate number of the total of their employee, so sometimes you can't tell which is the ratio of the sample to the population. Many research projects use a combination of sampling techniques that fit the research design. All choice depends on the ability to gain access to the organization. Sometimes you are willing to gain or to take information from targeted employee or top managers, senior managers, but you can't tell if you can reach them. If you will have an access, they will allow you to interview them or to have to have some answer to your survey and to participate in your survey. So now let's move to the type of data that maybe you use in your research. We start with using secondary data. From this chapter, we assume that you will be familiar with the full variety of secondary data that are available for the researcher. Why we use sometimes secondary data? Does it match your research question and objectives, or it's just it was done for another purpose different from your research question and objectives? For sure, there will be some advantage for using secondary data because it's already done. There is also disadvantage. Maybe it doesn't match your research question. There is some bias. Evaluate suitability of secondary data for answering your research questions and meeting objectives in terms of coverage, validity, reliability, and measurements bias, to apply specific knowledge, skill, and understanding that you gain that support you in doing your research project. So let's have a look on the definition of the secondary data in comparison with the primary data. Secondary data is data that have already been collected for some other purposes different from your research question or your objectives of your research, while the primary data, which we prefer, can be collected specifically for the purposes of answering your research question and meet research objective. So types of the secondary data: documentary and surveys. The documentary, sometimes you need to use in your research projects. We use primary data collection methods. It's another source of secondary data. Survey that collected through a questionnaire, also analyzed for their original purposes. As we mentioned, it's maybe different from your research question. Multiple source secondary data can be based entirely on documentary or on survey, can be amalgamed, that combined together. The key factor that different data set can be combined to form another data. You have a combination, different data that they can serve in your purpose, your aim. So there is documentary, written like journals, interviews. There is non-written materials from the media, TV, videos, whatever. And multiple source, depends on the area or the time. Government publication, books, journals, and time. That's something related to the year or time of the year, and to have a general survey that related to the secondary data. So multiple source secondary data, like as we mentioned, time series that cover period of time, not just a snapshot, or some cohort studies that complied for the same population over time using a series of snapshots that can be repeated over time, or like by the end of the year, the employee, they will fill some questionnaire to show their satisfaction, their needs, or whatever, like a survey. It can be done by the end of each semester in the university, by the end of each year in some companies. Area-based data, as we mentioned, multiple or multi-source secondary data can be combined together, can be joined together to study differences between different geographical area or different data sets. So finding the data, two-stage process, how to allocate the data that you need or may be useful for your research, if it's available or not, and locating the precise of the data required, that you can evaluate to what extent that type of data will be helpful in your research project. references in the publications like books, journals, articles. When you refer to the references, they will show from where they obtained some information, and you go for more extra information within organization. Some unpublished works or sources, it will be found in the organization. Maybe you will not easy to have access to this information. Tertiary literature, indexes, catalog in archive or online, you can search for it. So finding secondary data, as we mentioned, references in the published guides, data held by the organization, and it's unpublished, data on the internet. So what's the advantage for using or finding secondary data in your research projects? So it requires fewer resources. So unobtrusive, often drawn from information recorded for other purposes than scientific research. It's unseen. It can be considered as hidden or not visible. So, and comparative and contextual data, unforeseen discoveries may occur. Sometimes you'll discover new information or obtain new information after processing these data, generally permanent and available, these secondary data. While the disadvantage, that the main disadvantage, that the purpose for collecting or for what it was collected, this data or use, is completely different from your research question, but maybe to some extent it can serve or help your research questions. Access may be difficult or costly. Sometimes you are not allowed to reach some unpublished information in the organization. Some agencies maybe will ask for high price to sell you this type of data or bulk of emails, groups like this. Aggregation and definition may be unsuitable. Sometimes to combine varieties, different things together, will not bring good results. No real control over that data quality. You can't tell if the accuracy, the reliable, the credibility of this data, and initial purpose maybe affect data presentation. So what we need to ensure for the data sources that enable the research question to be answered, it will match your research question and objectives, it will fit the methodology and the strategy that you adopt in your research, enable research objectives to be met for sure, have greater benefits than their associated costs that will cost you some money, and it will serve or it nonsense, allow access for the research also. So just before decide to adopt this source of secondary data, to ask some question. Assess overall suitability of data research question and objective. Is suitable for your research question and objectives, your methodology, measurements validity, coverage including unmeasured variables that maybe you processed again, replicate some finding, evaluate precise suitability of data for analysis needed to answer research questions and meet objectives, validity, reliability, measurements bias, and to judge whether to use based on assessments of cost and benefits in comparison to alternative choice from where to obtain your data. Then you can say go or no go with these secondary data. Overall suitability of the data, that's something you need to take in account. Precise suitability, including reliability and validity of the data, assessment of the collection methods, a clear explanation of collection techniques, how they obtain these secondary data, and how they measure, assess the validity of this secondary data, and to be sure there is no bias or deliberate distortion in this data. Overall suitability points to be considered also coverage and unmeasured variables and cost and benefits. By this, let's just review. Secondary data consists of three main types: documentary, survey, or multiple sources. The data can be used in different ways. It may be not current, it will be a little bit old. It may serve your research question or not. Data source should be assessed for suitability, measurements, validity, and coverage. Evaluation should be critically evaluate the source of secondary data and to take account the cost and benefits, and to be sure that it may contain some bias. It will not give you the proper finding that serve your research question. And remember to check the research project assessment regulations regarding the use of secondary data, if it's allowed or it's preferable to use other than secondary data. By this, we conclude our lecture. Thank you very much.